Would you believe me if I said this was a fantasy remake of the Roger Corman movie Space Raiders? It also clearly is influenced by Game of Thrones. We are talking The Last Redemption from 2024. And this is directed by John Reel, and he actually co-wrote the movie. And he has a role in the movie. Of course, he gets the love interest and the sex scene, of course, being the director. Why wouldn't you? He actually plays a character called Lord Tyrion. So tell me this isn't actually a influenced by Game of Thrones. He's also a bastard whose dad is James Cosmos. Anyway, let's talk about that cast. So it actually has a cast of recognisable faces from a variety of fantasy projects. Heading up the cast, of course, is Kevin Sorbo, probably most known for the Hercules Legendary Journeys TV show. You've got Hal Yamanouchi, of course, from a whole bunch of Italian movies, such as Hearts and Armour. You've got Angus McFadden, of course, from Braveheart. And you've got James Cosmos, as I've mentioned, from Game of Thrones. Now, the story. Okay, so it focuses on a kind of fantasy kingdom, and we start off with our king who is fighting off orcs, as you do, and he is ruling the kingdom, but he's got a kind of a challenger to his rule in Kevin Sorbo's character, who is a lord that has the eye on the throne himself. So this Kevin Sorbo's character hires a bunch of outlaws to break into the castle with him and kill the king, of which he'll blame the outlaws and then claim the kingdom whilst giving them a bunch of money. Whilst they are in the middle of the act, the king's young daughter disturbs them, little girl, and half the outlaws want to save this little girl, whilst the other half kind of are ordered to kill the little girl because she's a witness. And that crisis of conscience means these bunch of outlaws kind of get split into two groups, with the good guy outlaws, I suppose, running off with this girl and trying to keep her safe, a la Space Raiders. And then we've got variety of kind of forces out to try and stop them, the forces of these kingdoms, orcs, other outlaws. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's talk about it. What works? Okay, so this is a low-budget film, but what does work in this film? I will say I have to say I like the kind of the costuming here. They've gone quite full out with kind of fantasy sort of armour, various different kind of like knight type kind of costumes and sort of paladin sort of characters and things like that. And I've got to say, I thought the costuming department, the kind of the hair and that sort of thing, the general kind of like dress of the film, I think looks pretty good. Large portions of it are filmed in the woods, obviously a very cheap location, but we do get some kind of sequences at the beginning of the movie, kind of inside. And I've got to say, again, I thought the location shooting was fair, and it does have a pretty good sense of production, even though it's clearly a low budget film, because I think, as I say, the costumes are quite extravagant and I quite like them. There's quite different sort of armour and things. The orc makeup kind of looks a little bit like the kind of the orcs from the Lord of the Rings and things like that. So, you know, even though this has that low budget feel to it, I still have to say I was quite impressed with the production design here. It is kind of maybe where I'm going with that. The film is relatively kind of well shot. Maybe there's a little bit too much slow-mo here. Maybe there's a few too many drone shots, but generally speaking, I think the movie is shot kind of fairly well and makes use of the kind of the natural environment, you know, to kind of have this kind of misty woods and this kind of fantasy kind of landscape and things like that. There were a couple of characters that I liked. I quite liked the kind of the Kevin Sorbo character as he's kind of duplicitous kind of like lord who's looking after himself. There's one of the kind of the good guy outlaws, which is this guy who kind of doesn't sort of speak, and you know, he kind of builds this kind of like bond with this girl he's trying to kind of protect and things like that. So there were a couple of characters here that I thought were quite fun. And I think, again, the movie is very much like the plot of Space Raiders. I mean, I don't know if it was actually influenced by that, but I have seen a few times where B movies have been remade. I think no one will notice because it was a low budget B movie that no one's really seen. But who knows? But yeah, the plot is still kind of quite, you know, an interesting idea here with this, you know, focusing on a group of outlaws that have kind of split into two separate factions, trying to kind of save this little girl. It's relatively obvious where it's all going to go, don't get me wrong, but nonetheless, I think the idea here of this story is reasonable. Okay, so what doesn't work? Let's go with the biggest issue for me first. This movie, unfortunately, is a little dull. And there's a number of reasons for this. Primarily, I think the pacing is just a little bit too slow. There is a lot of time just sort of running through the woods. The action is kind of quite sparse. We'll come on to the action again in a minute because there's a problem with that. The action is quite sparse though, so you don't get a huge amount. The elements here, like they introduce this orc army, but nothing is really done with it. They're just kind of like, you know, there, but they don't really have any real impact on the story. But generally speaking, the proceedings are just a little dull. But what adds to that is, for example, the fight scenes are not very well choreographed. Now, it is a low-budget film, so again, we have to give it some kind of leeway in regards to that. But they are not particularly well choreographed. And it's one of these films where, you know, our central characters have plot armor until they don't. And everyone just cuts a swathe. So we get, like, I think there's 3 different orc attacks in this movie. These orcs just get massacred. They pose no real threat. Any bad guys, be it a group of other kind of outlaws, be it our knights from the kingdom, whenever they come across our main characters, they're dealt with no problem. So there's no stakes. So we've got a kind of a slow and quite dull storyline with little action scenes. When we do get the action scenes, there's no tension in there. So ultimately it makes the kind of the proceedings not all that interesting. The acting and the dialogue generally isn't good. Now, there are a couple of established and well-known actors here who obviously do better. But for the most part, I've got to say, I think the acting is mixed at best. And the dialogue sequences, you know, are a little bit trite at times. John Reel's character, I have to say, seems like it's completely superfluous to this movie. It feels like he's written himself a role because he kind of wants to have like the love interest and have this like Jon Snow sort of style character whilst being called Tyrion. You know, have the kind of the sex scene with the kind of the female lead and do all that and be like have heroic scenes. But his character, I felt, wasn't necessary. You know, it wasn't necessary. And again, it just kind of bloats the film, unfortunately. Some of the actors, you know, speaking with an accent, not the best kind of delivery and things like this. Some of the actors are obviously from like America and the UK and stuff, but yeah, it's a mixed bag in sort of regards of the acting. I think the movie is relatively kind of well shot, but as I have mentioned, it does rely a little bit too much on slow-mo. You know, Zack Snyder's looking at this thinking, blimey, there's a lot of slow-mo in this movie. And there's maybe, like I say, a few too many kind of drone establishing shots and kind of things like that. The actual story, whilst I do think it has an interesting hook, ultimately it's very, very predictable at the end of the day. And there's certainly missed opportunities. And I have some problems with some specifics. So let me give you one example here. So we have our group of outlaws that end up splitting into 2 separate groups. And one of these groups is our good guy. Now, at the beginning of the movie, all of the outlaws were hired to kill the king. And they go into this castle when they're facing off against the king, kill all his guards, and then this little girl comes in, and then they kind of have a change of heart. But the king is ultimately killed by Kevin Sorbo's character. And then they, through the movie, they're like taking the moral high ground, like, well, we didn't kill the king. Like, well, no, not you personally, but you were 100% there to do that. That is why you went there. And it was just like, they're kind of almost like, oh, we're the good guys because we didn't kill the king, it was this other guy. Yes, but you were hired to do it, and you went there with the intention of at least supporting the kind of the attempt to kill the king, even though you didn't personally do it yourself. And it's like, the moralising here is a little bit off centre to me. Overall, I've got to say, I think this movie does come out a slightly below average film. Ardent kind of fantasy and sword and sorcery movies fans may want to check it out, but I don't think it's a particularly great example of the genre. I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Please leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.